What up? What up? I was wearing a jacket, and then there was, this whole faux casual thing. And,
It's not faux. I've been this way my whole.
but then Alyssa did remind me, that the whole shirt sleeve, roll up the sleeves thing, that is
Your vibe.
kind of the brand.
That was your
That's
vibe.
the vibe
Yeah.
for this crew. So, good to see everybody.
You too.
Hello.
Good to see everybody.
Okay, so first question's from me.
Okay.
Okay. So 15 years ago, a lot of people in this room were in Grant Park on arguably the nicest night that Chicago ever could have given us, weather-wise.
Unbelievable.
And I know that all of us have talked over the years about, well, do you remember this and do you remember that? And our memories have iterated. And so I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us what you think about that night when you look back on it?
I'll be honest with you, and some of you have heard me say this. I felt pretty sober that night. Because I was fairly optimistic at that point that we were going to win. And I had said to everybody on the campaign trail, to staff, that the point of winning was not the celebration, standing up. The point of winning was then to do the work. And I have to say that by the time the official announcement was made, I was already spending a lot of time thinking about the work. And so there was a satisfaction. The thing probably that I remember the most was sitting in the hotel waiting for the final call. And Pete Souza took a picture of this. Some of you may have seen it. Michelle was off with the girls doing something in another corner of the room. And I'm sitting there with Michelle's mom. And we're just watching the television. And she's just quiet, and she's just sitting there. And I remember thinking to myself, what does this mean for her? Mm-hmm. She was born and raised in Inglewood on the South Side, had moved then to South Shore, married, raised a family. During her childhood, even her going or being taken to Marshall Fields or one of the department stores downtown, if she could go in, she wouldn't have been welcomed. She had family, people, smart, skilled tradesmen, some educators who could never aspire to do more than work in a factory or work as a clerk. And so she's sitting there and she's witnessing that her daughter is about to be the First Lady of the United States. And I remember her she was very quiet, and then she just, and she's not a demonstrative person, and she just reached out and held my hand. And I think that's something that stayed with me.
I was thinking about how much the world has changed over the last 15 years. And obviously, you dealt with your fair share of crises in the White House. We all remember that. But we were never living in fear that if we lost the next election, that we might lose our democracy. And obviously, that is a fear that is very much with us right now. And I know you've talked a lot about what it will take to protect democracy and That's involves policies that improve people's lives and structural reforms and strengthening institutions and winning elections. But you and I have talked a lot over the years about the power of a really good story. And I wonder if you were running for president today in this political environment, in this media environment, what story would you tell about why democracy is a better choice than what the demagogues and authoritarians are selling?
So I think the starting point is to talk about the things that are uppermost on people's mind to give you a permission structure to get to democracy, right? One of the things that we learned about 2016 is if you are simply running against and fear and you don't have a positive story to tell about the concrete challenges that people face, folks may not get to that higher level story about the meaning of the country and so forth. So I remember during the midterms when I was a surrogate helping folks out, one of the things I really insisted on is, well, we need to talk about inflation, and we need to talk about crime, and we need to talk about immigration. We need to talk about the things that are uppermost in people's minds or are being fed to people, and speak about those squarely, and that's the gateway to then get to where we want to be. So that's point number one. Look, if you think back to what we did in 08, 12, ideally when we were on our game during the course of the presidency, the story really didn't change about America. And the story was you have a bunch of people show up on these shores, many of them outcasts, many of them escaping tyranny, escaping crushing poverty, escaping discrimination, escaping caste, and trying to make of their lives what they could. And even more importantly, trying to make sure that their kids had something different. And it was always from the very beginning, an experiment in overcoming the gap between ideals and reality. And democracy was never exactly as promised. And then we had a bunch of people who worked together to realize that promise. And I think the argument we can tap into right now is reminding people of the fact that we've been through stuff like this before. We've been through eras in which, not that long ago, in which black people were second-class citizens, in which gay people were in the closet out of necessity, because otherwise they might not be able to be employed, or worse. We've been in situations in which women were subordinate. And the good news is that because we had this system of being able to persuade each other about the better angels of our nature in fits and starts, we got better. We got kinder, we got more tolerant, and it's never been perfect, and it's never been, it's always been messy. But there was a pathway for us to express our best selves, and that was true not just for Democrats, it was true for Republicans too. And so I think that's the starting point for then to be able to say, and some of you have heard me say this, it's not as if the entire history of this country, Democrats were on the right side of this thing. Democrats, for most of modern history, up until the civil rights legislation, they were anti-democratic and terrorized people and killed them for trying to exercise their democracy. So we don't have clean hands. And I think acknowledging that is, again, an entryway. What I'm always trying to look for is a way to get to the point where somebody who otherwise wouldn't listen and is fearful and is angry and suspicious can stop because they feel as if I saw them for a second. And I understood their lives. And in that moment, maybe then I can persuade them that this precious thing we have, which is our ability to sort things out and exercise forbearance towards each other and understanding and just getting along and listening, if I can get to that moment, then I think we'll be okay. And that's really the instinct that people have. Look, let's face it, we did well in this last midterm, not because all the trend lines were in our favor. It was because the majority of people believe in that story, and they recognize it in their own lives. And so speaking to them on those terms is what's vital, which is why I think the last time we were together, I said that kind of forbearance, we have to model and exercise as well. And a losing strategy for us, I think, is when we are so insistent on our purity, when we're so self-righteous about our positions that we can't see those folks, or we're talking down to them, or our general attitude is, that we're going to convince you about how wrong you are. I have not seen that work yet. Now, look, last point I'll make, and I think about this a lot because I've been writing about it. There are times, there are moments, there is room for a prophetic voice, just radical truth-telling. And not only is that sometimes satisfying, but our own base sometimes needs to hear that, right? But you have to pick and choose your spots, and you always have to, even when you're in that mode, you've got to give people an opening you have to give them an invitation to there's got to be room for them in that truth that you're speaking. I'm telling you something maybe that you don't want to hear, but you know what? I'll bet you can understand it and be a part of us addressing that truth. So, all right.
So, speaking of those kinds of conversations, last week you wrote this thoughtful, nuanced statement on the situation in Israel and Gaza. Unfortunately, the debate online, especially on social media, is not that. It's can be very strident and dug in, and a lot of people fighting and talking past each other. I imagine there's a lot of people in this room or people listening at home who see what's happening, care deeply, want to be educated, want to participate in the conversation, but they're scared of saying the wrong thing, hurting someone's feelings unnecessarily, or just kind of not knowing enough to participate, and therefore they kind of tap out. What's your advice to people who want to participate in these debates that can feel so fraught about what the path forward is?
Look, I always say I probably wouldn't have been elected even to the Senate, and certainly not the presidency, had there not been this weird convergence with the internet and early social media. I was an outsider. I didn't have the backing of institutions and organizations, and there was so much power in seeing all these young voices being able to gather together, and from every walk of life. But I'm dating myself now. It was mostly MySpace and Meetup. And I always, because I've been working a lot on social media issues and misinformation and now AI, I always point out, the thing about Meetup was you had to meet up. Right? Because it's a pretty crude Flintstone tool, right? You send, it's like, hey, we're going to be in the church basement in Des Moines on Saturday, meet up. That was pretty much the extent of the technology.
Yeah, it's like a cork board.
But the reason I tell that story is that the power of meeting up is something that all of you will remember whenever we'd walk into a campaign office. Whatever your idea of what an Obama supporter was, when you got into the campaign office, just as was true if you went to a meetup meeting, is you've got a young black woman with a nose ring, and you've got some middle-aged white guy in a flannel shirt and a buzz cut who's a Army veteran, and you've got a Hispanic gay engineer, and the reason that was powerful was because you imagine at the first meetup meeting, okay, I've got an assumption about what an Obama supporter is. But then when I sit there, it turns out that that person's not actually completely like me. And if they're talking, that means that they've got some quirky ideas. And I promise you, you all know, we had some quirky volunteers. and had some who had some unexpected views that did not correspond to, the litmus test of progressivism, right? The reason I'm telling that story is because what that allowed was for all of us to see each other in their complexity and then still decide, all right, let's work together. And then they had to all go out and knock on doors and meet people who were even more quirky, right? So, going back to obviously a serious question, there's no way to avoid, in this particular moment on this particular issue, after so much blood has been spilled against the backdrop of this history. It doesn't matter whether it's online or in person. There is going to be rage and anger and not just generational traumas, right? I mean, this is century-old stuff that's coming to the fore. And and you've witnessed the kind of worst cruelty and tragedy that can befall people involving children and spouses and grandparents. And passions are going to be high. But what I will say is that if there's any chance of us being able to act constructively to do something, it will require an admission of complexity and maintaining what on the surface may seem contradictory ideas. That what Hamas did was horrific, and there's no justification for it. And what is also true is that the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians is unbearable. And what is also true is that there is a history of the Jewish people that may be dismissed unless your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your uncle or your aunt tell you stories about the madness of anti-Semitism. And what is true is that there are people right now who are dying who have nothing to do with what Hamas did. And what is true, right? I mean, we can go on for a while. And the problem with the social media and trying to TikTok activism and trying to debate this on that is you can't speak the truth. You can pretend to speak the truth. You can speak one side of the truth. And in some cases, you can try to maintain your moral innocence by virtue of just grabbing that slice of the truth. But that won't solve the problem. And so if you want to solve the problem, then you have to take in the whole truth. And you then have to admit nobody's hands are clean, that all of us have are complicit to some degree. I look at this and I think back, what could I have done during my presidency to move this forward as hard as I tried? I've got the scars to prove it. But there's a part of me that's still saying, well, was there something else I could have done? That's the conversation we should be having. Not just looking backwards, but looking forward. And that can't happen if we are confining ourselves to our outrage. And even what I just said, which sounds very persuasive, still doesn't answer the fact of, all right, how do we prevent kids from being killed today? So, which is why in conversations that I've had with some of the young activists, I come with some humility and I say, look, I get why you might not want to look at history and context, and that's your primary concern. But the problem is that if you are dug in on that, well, the other side is dug in remembering the videos that Hamas took of what they did on 7th, and they're dug in too, and which means we will not stop those kids from dying. So my advice to young people who want to get involved, I guess it's not possible anymore to download Meetup.
Whatever it is.
But approximate that. I would rather see you out there talking to people including people who you disagree with. If you genuinely want to change this, then you've got to figure out how to speak to somebody on the other side and listen to them and understand what they are talking about and not dismiss it. Because you can't save that child without their help. Not in this situation. So, all right. We went over time, didn't we? That zero's been on, look. Come on, you guys know me. Don't bait me with a question like that and then think this is why I could never win these debates.
That's actually Dan's last question.
Yeah. That's right.
I mean, that's all right.
Sir.
Yes, sir.
You sat down with us on your last full day in the White House, which is, I'm sure, how you planned to celebrate the end of your presidency.
I did.
You did. And in that interview, you talked about how you saw your legacy. And you said that you wanted your legacy to be not necessarily the policies you passed, but what the people who got involved in politics through your campaigns, your administration, were still doing years later to affect change. So here we are on the 15th anniversary of your election. Thousands of alumni are here. And I just wanted to close out here to get your reaction to what you see from what the people in this room are doing and how it makes you feel.
I mean, I am beaming with pride. I'm listening to Jesse and Lauren. I've had a chance. Yesterday, obviously, I stopped by your drunken bacchanal. I had a chance just now to speak to some of our senior team, and some of you have already heard this, but I'm going to repeat it because it bears repeating. I actually generally am not nostalgic. As I'm writing about the presidency, as I think about the presidency, as I look at current issues, I tend to remember the mistakes I made and the doubts and questions I have and the things I didn't get done and so, I don't look at things through rose-colored glasses. I remember how hard every step of the way was. But as I just mentioned, the team, the people, the family, the culture that we constructed, that feels as true as anything in my life. And it was reflected on the campaign, and it was reflected in the White House. It was, as Michelle said, reflected in people in high-profile positions in the West Wing and East Wing. It was reflected in people who were working out of the limelight in agencies and embassies. It was reflected by a bunch of kids dropped off in the middle of farms and communities that they had never imagined themselves being in. And yet somehow a bunch of 25 and some younger would persuade these communities that we had a chance to be better and listen to each other and treat each other with respect. And the fact that somehow that sustained itself across this many people, and this is just a fraction of the people who were involved, and that now is carried forward, whether it's somebody like Lauren in Congress or Deb Haaland, suddenly goes to, or it's somebody like Jesse or some of the folks you saw in the video who are, in their own communities, transforming the culture of those communities and modeling that kindness and hard work and responsibility and consideration and openness to other people. That gets me choked up. That makes me proud. And that is something that I think part of what sometimes all of us who were part of this struggle with is we know that's out there in the country, right? We can feel it. And we know that when people have a chance to feel that in themselves and in their communities and in their neighborhoods, they feel better than they do when they're angry and hateful and closed off and lonely, and feeling victimized. We know that. And so there's a part of us, I think, sometimes we just are so often what we're trying to figure out is how can we remind people of that? Not any particular campaign, but the fact that that honest human response is available to us and will ultimately save us. That's why I'm so proud of all of you. That's the thing that doesn't get old and stays with me and keeps me going. Yeah.
President Obama, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for bringing us all together, and thank you for giving every single person in this room and countless others the chance to go on this journey with you.
All right. Appreciate you guys. Love you.
Today's